How a captain sailed into his own silence. A ship that answered no signal, except its own echo. In the winter of 1968, beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, a submarine went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from mechanical failure or enemy detection, but the kind that spreads through a crew like fog through a valley, thick and inescapable. The USS Blackfin, a diesel-electric submarine carrying 47 souls, descended into depths where sunlight had never reached, and for 72 days, it stayed there, moving through the cold darkness like a ghost ship navigating its own memory. The men aboard did not know it yet, but they were not on a military patrol. They were test subjects in an experiment that would redefine what the United States Navy understood about control, obedience, and the breaking point of the human mind. This was not an accident. This was Operation Silent Compass, a classified psychological warfare research program designed to answer a single question that had haunted military strategists since the beginning of the Cold War. How long can a man follow orders when those orders make no sense, when communication becomes meaningless, and when the chain of command becomes an echo chamber of his own doubt? The Blackfin was chosen because it was old, expendable, scheduled for decommissioning within 2 years. Its captain, Commander James Holloway, was chosen because he was loyal, experienced, and most importantly, because his psychological profile suggested he would never question a direct order, no matter how strange it seemed. The mission briefing took place in a windowless room in Norfolk, Virginia, on a Tuesday morning that felt like every other Tuesday morning in military history. Holloway sat across from two men he had never seen before, men whose names were never written down, whose faces he would later struggle to remember with any clarity. They told him his mission was simple. Take the Blackfin on an extended patrol, maintain radio silence unless absolutely necessary, follow a predetermined route through deep Atlantic waters, and return in 72 days. They told him this was a readiness drill, a test of endurance and discipline, a way to evaluate crew performance under prolonged isolation. They did not tell him that every order he would receive over the next 2 months would be carefully designed to destabilize his sense of reality, that his crew had been selected not for their skills but for their psychological vulnerability, or that the real mission had nothing to do with Soviet submarines and everything to do with understanding how authority could be weaponized against the mind itself. Holloway accepted the mission without hesitation because that is what good officers do. He did not ask why the briefing was conducted by civilians, why the patrol route seemed deliberately circular, or why he was instructed to keep even the executive officer uninformed about certain sealed orders that would be opened at specific intervals during the voyage. He simply saluted, gathered his documents, and walked back into the cold Virginia morning where his crew was waiting, unaware that they were about to become footnotes in a study that would never be published, never be acknowledged, and never be repeated. The Blackfin left port on February 14, 1968, sliding into the gray Atlantic water with the kind of routine departure that marked 1,000 other submarine patrols. The crew was young, mostly in their 20s, a mix of experienced seamen and fresh recruits who had joined the Navy to escape small towns and uncertain futures. They knew the risks of submarine duty, the claustrophobia, the recycled air, the constant hum of machinery that became the soundtrack of their existence. What they did not know was that among them were 3 individuals who were not regular sailors, men who had been inserted into the crew roster by naval intelligence, trained observers whose only job was to watch, record, and report on how the crew responded as the mission unfolded. These men kept logs that were never entered into official records, logs that described not operational details but emotional states, breakdowns in communication, shifts in loyalty, and the slow erosion of trust that occurs when reality stops making sense. For the first 2 weeks, everything proceeded normally. The submarine followed its route, diving to operational depth during the day, surfacing briefly at night to ventilate and recharge batteries. The crew fell into the rhythm of submarine life, rotating through their watches, eating meals in shifts, sleeping in narrow bunks stacked 3 high. Holloway maintained discipline with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 15 years at sea, a man who understood that on a submarine, order is not just a military necessity but a psychological lifeline. He ran drills, inspected compartments, spoke to his men with a kind of calm reassurance that made them believe everything was under control. And in those first 2 weeks, everything was. Then, on day 16, Holloway opened the first sealed envelope. He did this alone in his quarters, a space barely larger than a closet, lit by a single dim bulb that cast his shadow long against the metal wall. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with typed instructions, no signature, no explanation. The order was simple. Beginning immediately, all crew communications would be restricted to written notes only. No spoken words except during emergencies. The rationale provided was a test of alternative communication protocols in case of acoustic detection threats. Holloway read the order 3 times, trying to find some operational logic that would make it reasonable. He found none. But the order was clear, and it came with the classification level that meant questioning it was not an option. He called the crew to quarters and delivered the news in a calm, measured voice, explaining it as a training exercise, a temporary protocol to test their adaptability. The men reacted with confusion, some laughter, a few muttered complaints that died quickly under Holloway's steady gaze. They adapted because they had no choice, because that is what submariners do. Within hours, the interior of the Blackfin transformed into a strange theater of silence where men communicated through hastily scribbled notes passed between hands, where orders were written on clipboards, where even casual conversation required a pencil and paper. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. Without spoken language, the submarine felt colder, emptier, as if the absence of voice had drained something essential from the air itself. The three observers noted that within 48 hours, interpersonal conflicts increased. Without the ability to resolve misunderstandings through conversation, small grievances festered. A note misinterpreted, a sarcastic comment written in haste, a request denied without explanation, all of these created fractures in the social fabric that would have been easily repaired with a few spoken words. But speech was forbidden, and so the fractures spread, silent and slow, like cracks in ice under pressure. On day 23, Holloway opened the second envelope. This one instructed him to alter the patrol route without explanation, to circle back over areas already covered, to follow a path that made no strategic sense. The crew noticed. How could they not? They were trained navigators who understood ocean currents and patrol patterns, who knew when a route was purposeful and when it was random. But they said nothing because they could say nothing, and because questioning a captain's orders was a line that good sailors did not cross. Instead, they wrote their questions in private journals that would later be confiscated and analyzed, journals that revealed a growing sense of disorientation, a feeling that the mission had no purpose, that they were moving through the ocean without direction or meaning. The silence became oppressive. Men who had served together for months found themselves avoiding eye contact, communicating only when necessary, retreating into private spaces where they could escape the weight of unspoken tension. Meals were eaten in complete quiet, the only sounds the clatter of utensils and the ever-present hum of the submarine's systems. Sleep became difficult because the mind, deprived of verbal expression, turned inward, replaying conversations that could no longer happen, rehearsing arguments that would never be spoken. The observers noted an increase in anxiety, irritability, and what they clinically described as social withdrawal patterns consistent with prolonged sensory deprivation. Holloway felt it too. He was not immune to the psychological pressure, despite his training and experience. He began to notice that his own thoughts were becoming repetitive, circular, trapped in loops that had no resolution. He would lie awake in his bunk, staring at the metal ceiling inches from his face, trying to understand why he was following orders that seemed designed to accomplish nothing. But every time doubt crept into his mind, he pushed it away with the discipline that had defined his entire career. Orders were orders. The mission was the mission. His job was to command, not to question. On day 31, the third envelope changed everything. The instruction was brief and impossible. Holloway was to inform the crew that they were being pursued by an unidentified submarine, that all communication with command had been lost, and that they were now operating under complete radio silence with no external guidance. This was a lie. There was no pursuing submarine. Communications were not lost. But the order came with the same classification, the same authority, and Holloway, despite every instinct screaming that something was wrong, followed it. He assembled the crew and delivered the news in writing, posting it on the main bulletin board where every man would see it during their rotation. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Fear spread through the submarine like electricity through water. Men who had been merely tense became paranoid. Every sound, every vibration through the hull, every distant echo picked up by the sonar became evidence of the enemy they had been told was hunting them. The observers noted that within 24 hours, several crew members began exhibiting symptoms of acute stress disorder. Trembling hands, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, and in 2 cases, panic attacks that had to be managed with sedatives from the ship's limited medical supplies. But something else happened too, something the designers of Operation Silent Compass had anticipated and perhaps even hoped for. The crew began to bond in their fear. United by a common threat, they stopped questioning the strange orders, the circular patrol route, the imposed silence. They became cohesive in their paranoia, trusting each other because they had no one else to trust, following Holloway's commands without hesitation because he was the only authority figure in a world that had become unpredictable and dangerous. In the absence of external reality, they created their own, a shared delusion that made sense of senselessness and gave meaning to meaninglessness. Holloway saw this transformation and understood, perhaps for the first time, what was really happening. He realized that the mission had never been about Soviet submarines or patrol patterns. It was about control. It was about discovering how far men could be pushed, how much confusion they could endure, how completely they would submit to authority when fear and isolation left them no other choice. He realized that he was not a captain conducting a military operation but a participant in an experiment, and that every order he had followed, every envelope he had opened, had been a step in a carefully designed process to break down rational thought and replace it with obedience. And yet he continued. Because to stop would be to admit that everything he had done was wrong, that he had led his men into a psychological trap, that his loyalty and discipline had been weaponized against him. So he opened the next envelope and the next, each one containing orders that became progressively stranger, more disconnected from any military logic. He was instructed to conduct drills that served no purpose, to alter course based on random numbers, to enforce new rules that contradicted previous rules. The crew followed every order because they had been conditioned to believe that survival depended on obedience, that the invisible enemy hunting them could only be escaped if they remained disciplined, silent, and loyal. By day 50, the psychological deterioration was severe. Men began experiencing auditory hallucinations, hearing voices through the hull, phantom sonar pings that the equipment did not register. Some reported seeing movement in the shadows, figures that disappeared when they turned to look directly. The observers documented these symptoms with clinical detachment, noting that they were consistent with prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and sustained stress. They also noted that despite the deteriorating mental state of the crew, operational discipline remained intact. Orders were followed. Watches were maintained. The submarine continued to function because its crew had been so thoroughly conditioned that even as their minds fractured, their training held. Holloway began to lose track of time. Days blended together into a continuous present where past and future ceased to have meaning. He stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time, spending most of his waking moments in the control room, staring at charts that showed a route going nowhere, monitoring systems for threats that did not exist. He wrote reports that no one would read, maintained logs that documented nothing of importance, performed the rituals of command even as he understood that command itself had become theater, a performance for an audience that was studying him as much as he was leading them. On day 68, 4 days before the scheduled end of the patrol, Holloway opened the final envelope. It contained a single sentence: resume normal operations and return to port. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what had occurred, no guidance on how to undo 70 days of psychological manipulation. Just an order to return, as if the entire mission had been routine, as if nothing unusual had happened. Holloway sat in his quarters holding that piece of paper, feeling something inside him break in a way that he knew would never fully heal. He had done everything right, followed every order, maintained discipline and control, and in doing so he had allowed his crew to be used as laboratory subjects in an experiment that treated human minds as data points. He gave the order to surface and set course for Norfolk. He informed the crew that the threat had passed, that communications were restored, that they were going home. He reinstated verbal communication, telling them they could speak again, but many of them did not. The silence had become comfortable, familiar, safer than words. They had learned to exist without speech, and some part of them no longer remembered how to be any other way. The Blackfin arrived in port on April 26, 1968, 72 days after departure, exactly as scheduled. The crew disembarked into a world that felt alien and overwhelming after so long in controlled darkness. They were immediately separated and debriefed individually by personnel who asked questions designed to assess psychological damage and measure the success of the experiment. They were told their service was appreciated, that they had contributed to important research, and that everything they had experienced was classified and could never be discussed. Most of them obeyed that order too, carrying the memory of those 72 days in silence, adding it to the collection of things they would never talk about, not even to themselves. Holloway was debriefed for 6 hours by the same 2 men who had given him the mission, men whose names he still did not know. They showed him data, charts, psychological profiles, analysis of how the crew had responded to each stage of the operation. They explained that Operation Silent Compass had been a success, that it had provided valuable insights into psychological manipulation, authority compliance, and the creation of controlled environments where reality could be managed and perception could be shaped. They thanked him for his service and told him he would be commended, though the commendation would never appear in any official record. Then they told him he was being reassigned to a desk job in San Diego, a quiet position where he would process paperwork and train junior officers, far from the sea and further from anything that mattered. He accepted the reassignment without protest, because that is what he had been trained to do. But something had changed in him during those 72 days, something that could not be measured in psychological assessments or captured in debriefing reports. He had learned that loyalty could be a weapon, that obedience could be a cage, that the chain of command was not just a structure for maintaining order but a mechanism for controlling thought itself. He had learned that a man could follow every rule, execute every order, and still find himself complicit in something he could never fully understand or justify. The Blackfin was decommissioned in 1970, scrapped in a shipyard where its metal was melted down and reformed into something new, its history erased as thoroughly as the memories of the men who had served aboard it. The records of Operation Silent Compass were sealed and then, according to documents that would surface decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests, destroyed. The experiment was never officially acknowledged, never repeated under that name, though elements of its methodology would appear in later military psychological research, in studies of cult behavior, in analyses of totalitarian control systems. The 3 observers who had been embedded in the crew went on to careers in military intelligence, applying what they had learned about psychological manipulation in contexts that remain classified. Some of the crew members adjusted to civilian life, finding ways to function in a world where they no longer had to follow orders, where speech was allowed, where they could question authority without fear. Others struggled, carrying the silence with them, finding that they could never quite shake the feeling that they were still being watched, still being tested, still waiting for the next envelope to be opened and the next impossible order to be given. Holloway served his remaining years in the Navy in that quiet San Diego office, processing forms and teaching classes, never going to sea again. He retired in 1975 with full honors, a ceremony attended by colleagues who knew nothing of Operation Silent Compass, who saw only a career officer who had served his country with distinction. He moved to a small town in Oregon where he lived alone in a house near the coast, close enough to hear the ocean but far enough that he never had to see it. He did not talk about his time in the Navy, not to neighbors, not to the few friends he made, not even to the therapist he saw briefly in the early 1980s when the nightmares became too frequent to ignore. In 1989, a researcher studying Cold War psychological operations came across a heavily redacted document that referenced Operation Silent Compass. She filed requests for additional information and was told the program had never existed, that the document was a misfile, a remnant of some other project that had been incorrectly labeled. But she had seen the names, including Holloway's, and she tracked him down, driving to his small Oregon town and knocking on his door on a Tuesday afternoon that felt like every other Tuesday afternoon. She asked him about the Blackfin, about the 72 days, about what had really happened beneath the surface of the Atlantic in the winter of 1968. Holloway looked at her for a long time, this young woman with her tape recorder and her questions, and he felt the weight of 2 decades pressing down on him, the accumulated silence that had become heavier than any order he had ever followed. He told her to turn off the recorder. He told her there were some things that should stay buried, not because they were classified but because knowing them changed nothing, solved nothing, helped no one. He told her that the worst experiments are the ones where the subjects never realize they are part of an experiment until it is too late to refuse, and by then, refusal itself becomes impossible because everything you are has been built on the foundation of compliance. She left without getting her interview, but she wrote about the conversation anyway, publishing an article in an obscure academic journal that was read by perhaps 200 people. The article suggested that Operation Silent Compass was part of a broader pattern of military psychological research during the Cold War, experiments designed to understand not just how to resist enemy interrogation but how to create interrogation-resistant societies, populations that would follow orders without question because they had been conditioned to believe that obedience was survival and doubt was danger. Holloway died in 1994, alone in his house near the Oregon coast, his death noted in a small obituary that mentioned his naval service but provided no details. Among his possessions, his executor found a box of notebooks filled with entries written during his years of retirement, pages and pages of reflections on command, control, and the nature of authority. The notebooks described Operation Silent Compass in detail, every envelope, every order, every moment when he had chosen obedience over conscience. They described his understanding, arrived at too late to matter, that the experiment had not been about testing the crew's endurance but about testing his own willingness to implement orders that harmed the men under his command. The notebooks were never published. They were donated to a naval museum where they remain in storage, cataloged but unread, waiting for a researcher who might someday understand their significance. The story of the Blackfin and Operation Silent Compass exists now only in fragments, redacted documents, sealed records, scattered memories in the minds of men who are dying one by one, taking their silence with them. There is no official acknowledgement, no memorial, no recognition that 47 men spent 72 days being psychologically manipulated in the name of research that benefited no one except those who wanted to understand how completely human beings could be controlled when fear, isolation, and authority were applied in precise combination. But the lessons of Operation Silent Compass did not die with the men who participated in it. They live on in every system of control that relies on obedience without understanding, in every hierarchy that demands compliance without explanation, in every situation where people follow orders simply because they have been conditioned to believe that following orders is what good people do. The experiment proved that you do not need torture or violence to break a human mind. You only need confusion, isolation, and a voice of authority telling you that everything you are experiencing is necessary, is normal, is for the greater good. In the decades since the Blackfin returned to port, the techniques pioneered in Operation Silent Compass have been refined, sanitized, and incorporated into systems so commonplace that we no longer recognize them as mechanisms of control. We see them in corporate structures where employees follow procedures without understanding their purpose, in educational systems where students memorize answers without learning to question, in political movements where followers repeat slogans without examining their meaning. We see them everywhere that obedience is valued more than understanding, where loyalty is prized above conscience, where the chain of command becomes more important than the humanity of those bound by it. The submarine itself is gone, melted down decades ago, its atoms scattered and reformed into new shapes that serve new purposes. The men who sailed it are gone too, or soon will be, their memories fading into the silence they learned to inhabit. But the knowledge gained from their suffering persists, passed down through classified channels, studied in secure facilities, applied in contexts that remain hidden from public view. The experiment continues, not in submarines beneath the Atlantic but in the ordinary spaces where authority meets compliance, where orders are given and followed without question, where the line between leadership and manipulation becomes so thin that even those involved cannot see it anymore. James Holloway understood this before he died. He understood that the real horror of Operation Silent Compass was not what it did to him or his crew but what it revealed about the human capacity for obedience, the ease with which good men could be made to implement bad orders, the simplicity of the mechanisms needed to transform rational individuals into compliant subjects. He understood that the experiment had succeeded not because the techniques were sophisticated but because they were mundane, because they exploited the very qualities that military training is designed to instill: discipline, loyalty, trust and authority. And he understood, finally, that he had been both victim and perpetrator, both subject and instrument, a man who had followed orders so completely that he had become indistinguishable from the system that controlled him. He had sailed into his own silence, descending into depths where questions could not reach him, where doubt could not survive the pressure, where the only sound was the echo of his own compliance repeating endlessly in the darkness. And when he surfaced, when he returned to the world where speech was allowed and questions were possible, he found that the silence had followed him, that it had become part of him, that he could never fully escape the submarine of his own making. This is what Operation Silent Compass taught, though the lesson was never written in any official report: that the most effective prisons are the ones we build inside our own minds, the ones where the walls are made of loyalty and the bars are made of trust, where we lock ourselves in and throw away the key because we have been taught that this is what duty requires, what honor demands, what good soldiers do. And once those walls are built, once those bars are in place, no external force is necessary to keep us contained. We will police ourselves, silence ourselves, control ourselves with a thoroughness that no external authority could ever achieve. The Blackfin descended into darkness and returned to light, but the men aboard never truly left those depths. They carried the darkness with them, a portable prison that required no guards, no walls, no external enforcement. They had been taught to imprison themselves, and the lesson was so thorough, so complete, that most of them never realized they were still captive long after the experiment had officially ended. This is the true genius of psychological warfare. It does not need to be sustained by force because it transforms its subjects into willing participants in their own control. And this is why Operation Silent Compass remains classified, why its methods are protected, why its existence is officially denied. Not because the experiment was unusually cruel or because it violated specific regulations, but because it revealed a truth that military establishments, governments, and power structures of all kinds prefer to keep hidden. That human beings are frighteningly easy to control when you understand the mechanisms of obedience, that the distance between a free citizen and a compliant subject is shorter than we want to believe, that the line between leadership and manipulation is not a line at all, but a spectrum on which we all exist, moving back and forth depending on circumstances we rarely recognize and forces we almost never see. The submarine is gone. The men are gone. The official records are gone. But the silence remains, patient and enduring, waiting beneath the surface of every hierarchy, every command structure, every system of authority that asks us to trust without questioning, to follow without understanding, to obey without knowing why. It waits in the spaces between orders and execution, in the gap between what we are told and what we know, in the darkness where doubt goes to die and compliance is born. In the end, Operation Silent Compass was not an isolated experiment but a proof of concept. A demonstration that the greatest weapon in any arsenal is not the submarine or the missile but the human mind itself, specifically its capacity to accept control as natural, to embrace obedience as virtue, to transform imprisonment into identity. The 47 men who sailed aboard the Blackfin in the winter of 1968 did not know they were proving this concept. They thought they were serving their country, fulfilling their duty, doing what good sailors do. They were right, of course. They were doing exactly what good sailors do. That is what made the experiment work. That is what makes it work still. The ocean keeps its secrets, and so do the men who sail beneath its surface, carrying silence like cargo, transporting obedience from port to port, delivering compliance to destinations they were never told about. And when they surface, when they return to the world of light and speech and questions, they find that the depths have followed them, that some submarines never truly dock, that some voyages never truly end. James Holloway sailed into his own silence and never found his way back. His crew followed him down into those depths, and most of them, in their own ways, never fully surfaced either. They live now, those who still live, in the ordinary world where people speak freely and question openly and disobey without consequence. But part of them remains 72 days beneath the Atlantic, waiting for the next envelope to be opened, for the next order to be given, for the next impossible command that they will follow without hesitation because that is what they were trained to do, what they were conditioned to accept, what they learned in the darkness where silence was survival and obedience was the only compass that still pointed true. This is the archive that was never meant to be opened, the file that should have stayed sealed, the story that exists only in fragments and memories and classified documents that will never be declassified because to do so would be to acknowledge that the experiment never really ended, that Operation Silent Compass was not an isolated event from 1968 but a template, a methodology, a proof that the human mind can be controlled with nothing more than confusion, isolation, and a voice that sounds like authority. The voice still speaks in every system that demands compliance, in every hierarchy that requires obedience, in every structure where questions are discouraged and doubt is dangerous. It speaks in the language of duty and honor, in the vocabulary of loyalty and sacrifice, in words that sound noble but function as mechanisms of control. And most of us follow that voice without knowing we are following it, without recognizing the submarine we have boarded, without understanding that we have already descended into depths where the pressure makes questions impossible and the darkness makes doubt invisible. The Blackfin returned to port in 1968, but the voyage continues. It continues in every mind that has learned to silence itself, in every conscience that has been trained to defer to authority, in every individual who has internalized the lesson that obedience is safety and questioning is danger. The submarine still sails beneath the surface of society, beneath the surface of consciousness, carrying its cargo of compliant minds through waters that remain perpetually dark, perpetually silent, perpetually controlled. And somewhere in that darkness, James Holloway still sits in his captain's chair, opening envelopes that contain orders he will follow without question, leading men who trust him into depths from which they will never fully return, commanding a ship that answers no signal except its own echo, sailing through an ocean where the only navigation is obedience and the only destination is the silence we have been taught to call duty. Beneath the waves, command becomes confession. And confession in the end is just another word for surrender. If you've listened this far, you already know too much. The archives are open, but understanding comes at a cost. Subscribe to War Archives Black, where silence is documented and control is decoded. Like this video if you felt the pressure of depths you didn't know you descended into. And remember, the submarine is still sailing and you might already be aboard. The next archive waits in the darkness. Will you follow the signal or will you finally question the orders? Until then, stay vigilant, stay questioning, and never forget that the deepest prisons are the ones we build in our own minds.